Okay, here's the first in what I hope will be a series of videos talking about and demonstrating the best ways to stick lights inside your plastic spaceships. Excuse the squeakiness of my chair. Starting with this, the T-65 X-Wing, the flappy-winged version from the new second edition core set. So the idea is we are going to crack this open, remove the wing sections, drill into them, replace the peg with a connector which will have all the wires running to it, and put it all back together again. So first things first, we're going to remove the peg. Pair of pliers or clippers, well, I've got clippers here because I can't find my pliers. We just gently wiggle that back and forth, and it will do one of two things. It will either snap or come out whole like that. Better to try and get out whole, obviously, because then you've already got the hole there. So, oh, sorry, meant to say tools we'll be using here: pair of clippers, very sharp knife or scalpel, and a very small drill. That's, I think, 0.5 millimeter. We might need a slightly bigger one later on. So what we do is, what we're looking for here is the shut lines. You can see one across the back here connects this back piece, which comes all the way up across and is essentially an L shape running across the top here and down the back here to just in front of this R2 unit. So first of all, we'll get that in at the obvious seat, prise it apart a little bit, nice and easy, and you should be able to just leave it. There we go. You hear the glue go with a little snap, and that's that back section lifted. Now we take advantage of the fact that it leans slightly, get in underneath it and try to separate out here. You may want to get your knife in and just prise apart the seams ever so slightly. Be quite careful though, because you don't want to prise them apart too much and leave huge gaping witness marks that you then have to fill in with green stuff and paint over. Well, at least I don't, because my painting is terrible. So we've done that, and then we should just be able to lift that up. It's got quite a lot of give in it, so you should be able to lift it up quite far. And then just leave it away like so. There is a small pin under there, so we'll lift it up and you can see the pin there. We will be chopping that off anyway. And then that leaves the wing section to come out, which simply lifts out like so. You can see how it's made here. You've got the two wings which simply slot together to form your X, and they slot into this cavity in the body. So our next job is going to be to drill out these engines. The idea here is to take a very small drill bit and we drill into them about that far, up to sort of the main body of the engine, and then from the underneath we drill a hole in at an angle that intersects that hole drilled through. Now the hole in the bottom of the wing we are going to do with a slightly larger drill bit, just to maximise our chances of hitting the smaller hole. If we keep this hole to a diameter less than the diameter of the LEDs we use, it minimises the chances of pulling it through and having to re-thread it constantly later on in the process. So I will just get started on that, and make sure your drill bit is nice and secure rather than slightly loose, otherwise that happens. One good way of making sure you don't drill too far through them is to set it against the edge like that, set your length and then tighten down. That way you physically can't go too far, and you'll also know when you've hit the point you want, because you'll be flush up against the engine surface. I know, it's exciting stuff, this. That quality content that you wanted. Make sure you clean off your drill bit every now and then, just stuff built up. Also try and get it as straight in as possible. Some models you want to go in at a slight angle, so you're just drilling the single hole through and you want to protrude out of a lower surface. Not so much on the X-Wing. Hopefully I will get to one where you want to do that at a later date. So there we are, and that's drilled all the way down, and you can see exactly how deep that is. That goes to about there. So we make a mark about here and just drill. Easiest to start with a very, very tiny pilot hole vertically, just to get a dent in there so that you can then work in at an angle. Just makes life a little easier, because drilling in directly at an angle, even with something as small and pointy as this, can be a bit of a nightmare, as it will just slide right up like that. And trust me, these little drill bits are absolutely agony when you accidentally impale yourself on one. There we go. You can feel when it hits the other hole, you just feel a little notch that it goes through. So we just clear that out. Just run the drill bit through both holes again, just because it will leave like a small flare out when it comes through. And so we're trying to eliminate that and make it as continuous a hole through as possible. Now we'll just find a small piece of wire. And just try and run that through, just to make sure that it goes. That's not being happy. We'll try it from the other side, just to make sure that we have got full continuity all the way through before we start trying to force through a thin gauge wire. Ah, I see what I have done there. I have not intersected the hole. What I have done is come out the bottom, I think. Oh, I just felt it there. Yeah. But we'll double check that anyway. A lot of this is sort of trial and error, trying to get it in. What we'll do is we'll open that hole up with an ever so slightly larger drill bit. Bumping it up to a comparatively massive 0.9 millimeters. Thing is, because these holes are on the inside surfaces, they're not incredibly visible, even if you do make them ever so slightly larger than they need to be. So a lot of it is sort of drawing the eye away from where you don't want people to be looking on the model. So places where you've got holes coming through and the like. Incidentally, I would totally recommend using a hand drill rather than a small Dremel, especially on jobs this fine. I know a lot of people do use a Dremel for almost everything. Personally, I don't like it. It's far too easy to go a bit too far. It's far too easy to have your speed set too high and end up with a drill bit coated in melted plastic, which is a nightmare to get off. But, you know, your mileage may vary. I'm the son of an old school carpenter, so I like hand tools. So, 1 second, I'll just come back once I've managed to get that to work. So it turns out I actually had those holes perfectly aligned. I just wasn't forcing this through properly. As you can see, nice even curve going through there. Just makes it easier to run our wires through. So what we are using to light this is these 0402 surface mount LEDs. They are, as you can see, pretty bloody tiny. But they come on nice thin wires that you can run through a model pretty easily. Now the thing about these is LEDs will run at different power between 2.4 and 3 volts. What this effectively means is if you're only using a single colour in a model, you can get away with not putting in a resistor because they'll all draw the same power. You won't have a power draw somewhere along the line from a lower charge LED stopping the other ones from lighting. So on a model like this, you don't need a resistor. If I was doing, say, a Falcon with a bunch of lights and all different colours, then I'd have to drop resistors in to even out the voltage across all of them. What this also means is the other thing is that the voltage will depend on the colour. Your warmer colours, your reds and oranges, run at a lower voltage than your cold colours, your blues and your whites. So you can cheat a little bit and put red and orange, say, on the same circuit and blue and white on the same circuit. So if you want to light something with two colours but you don't really have the room or the inclination to stick a resistor in there, you cheat and you pick two colours that run at the same or nearly the same voltage, and that way you don't have to dick about with extra soldering and trying to find a position to hide a resistor in there. So as you can see, I've just run this wire through, just poke the LED down, and what we'll do is seal that. We'll leave it for the minute because I've got to do the other three engines, but what we'll do is seal that with just a tiny dab of super glue applied with the end of a cocktail stick. The best thing for doing that, applying that sort of thing, for poking at soldered joints, cocktail stick. It's disposable, they cost absolute buttons, and most importantly for wiring work, they're non-conductive, so it means you can, force apart a point where two wires are met that you don't want, get something in there to stop them meeting again. I am unfortunately out of them, so I will stop just here, do the other three engines because you don't really want to see me drilling those out again, and be right back when I've managed that. Okay, so that's pretty washed out. Sorry. So having drilled all of my holes and fed through all of my LEDs, what I am going to do now is just seal these into the ends. Like I said before, using super glue and a toothpick. I like the gel type super glue, but just because it is much easier to control and therefore much more suitable for tasks like this. And obviously using a toothpick makes it a lot easier to just apply a tiny amount around like that and dab the LED into the socket. Just seal it over. The other advantage to doing this, as well as obviously it holding everything in place and making it a bit easier to work with, is that standard cyanoacrylate gel superglues set slightly translucent, so you get a slight diffusion effect on the LED, which makes it look a bit nicer once it's done. So we'll just do that on all four, like so, just force it out a little bit. That's another top tip. It's much easier to push through from behind than to try and dig out that tiny LED if you need to pull it out slightly. Just feed it through whichever way you need it to go. We are also going to dink just a tiny dab onto the hole where it comes out, just to seal it over and make sure there's no movement later on when we get to trimming and chopping wires. Now you can get this set extremely quickly if you get some bicarbonate of soda and dust it on. Problem with doing that for this kind of application is that it basically bonds with the super glue and forms basically like a putty. It can be very good if you're doing modelling and you want to seal two not quite flush edges together. So that's a top tip for you if you find yourself doing that. If you're doing that though, don't use the gel super glue, use a liquid super glue, just because it mixes a bit better, a bit more evenly. So while that sets, we're going to switch our attention to the fuselage, where we are going to take the drill bit that I took out and put down and appear to have lost now, which was a... Where's that gone? That's incredibly confusing. Just 1 second. We're going to take a 2.2mm drill bit. Other sizes are available. Anything around the 2.5mm mark will work for this. And what we're going to do is just drill through the socket there that's empty out into this just under the R2 unit. If you have snapped off the peg rather than pulling it out cleanly, I would recommend starting with a smaller bit just to start a pilot hole. Otherwise you will end up slipping all over the place because the clear plastic that the pegs are made from is an absolute nightmare to get started in on with a larger drill bit. So there we go, just pops through like that. Now the idea is these wires are going to feed through. Once this piece is on, you can see a bit better. There is a small gap there between the front of the wing section hinge and the body. It's visible on a fully assembled X-Wing if you peer very closely at it. And that gap is just wide enough for those wires to go through. But what we are going to do first is just clear this up a tiny bit with a knife and just put a tiny channel in there for them to run in, just because we want everything to run as basically as smoothly and as kink free as possible through here. So the idea is they will run along this surface, right angle in again, and then straight down the hole out the bottom. I'll show you how that works just as soon as this glue is set. Okay, so we've given that 10-15 minutes just to set up, and now tug on the wires, nothing comes flying through. So what we're going to do is put the wings back together. For some reason the top left engine has this slightly different colour to the other three. Don't know why that is, but it gives you a handy guide as to which way up they go. If you've got one of these Saws Partisans X-Wings, you can actually flip the wings on those because they've got different design top and bottom, and you can choose to have either design on top or one wing on each side with each design. I'm just trimming these wires to roughly the same length just to make them easier to feed, because we're going to lose almost all of that length. So we'll just feed those into there through the hole that we made. Just cram through as many as possible, and then a pair of tweezers is actually really handy here. Just get the last couple through as well. And yes, someone on Facebook is trying to get a hold of me. It's probably nothing important. It never is. Okay, there we go. And we'll just reassemble these wings. If yours are excessively flappy, I've had a couple that have been like that. I think if you just get something onto that central peg there, just a tiny dab of something, I don't want to say glue, but something glue-like, just a tiny bit of silicone sealant maybe, just something to tighten up the whole joint. That would work beautifully to fix that if that's a problem on one of yours. So we feed that along and pop that whole assembly back into place, like so. And we can see there, wings closed, wings open, all the wires going through. We're just going to tuck these ones that have come up over the top back down, and that is all nice and neat. As you can see on the inside surfaces, we've got a very small exposed section of wire running along. I suppose in theory you could put that hole as far forward as possible to minimize that. I think for the amount that it shows, it's not really worth the effort, and we'll just glue this top back on as soon as I can see where I put down that tube of super glue. Brain like a sieve today. And just with a dab of super glue on the back and another one on the front now. Pop that on and squeeze that down. So that technically is all of the lighting done here. What we are going to do now is the bit that allows you to attach it to your base, which is where we are going to hide the battery, which I will actually show you as a separate video because it's slightly involved and it is universal for all of the ships that I do, at least the method I do them, and so I think is deserving of a video on its own. So what we're going to do here is trim these wires back to about that long, about a centimetre or so, and what we'll have is this connector connected there on a very, very short wire. We'll put a small piece of heat shrink insulation around it, heat that up, shrinks down, and that gives you a small, stiffer stem for them to all wind, for it to stand off. So what we'll do is it's easiest to work on these as positive then negative, or negative then positive, depending on how you go, but one polarity at a time. So feed off all of one colour of wire, because what you have to remember is LEDs will only work with the power running through them in one direction, and we'll just use the engine pods as something to wind the wires around so they don't get in the way. So let's just clip these off, and this is actually probably the hardest part, is stripping these tiny fine wires. What you can do is burn the insulation off with a flame. This is the other reason why we glue them down on the inside surface, is it just reduces the pull on the end of the LED, because it is very easy to pull these wires clean off the LED if you don't do that sort of thing. But if you burn them off, what I found is you get obviously the residue of the plastic sticks to the wire a little bit and makes it extremely hard to solder them, because it coats the wire and makes it less receptive to picking up the solder. And that's exactly what we didn't want to do, is accidentally trim the wire down. That's okay though. Okay. So you can see we've got 3 slightly longer ones and 1 slightly shorter one. That's fine. What we'll do is twist those longer ones together. And then we'll solder it back round in a loop, just because it's easier than trying to get a new LED in there, or trying to trim all of these ones back to that same shorter length. So I'll just twist that a tiny bit so that we've got a point on it. Force that round like so, So what you've got to bear in mind is that all of this will be covered by insulating wrap. And then we just take a teeny dab of solder, just like that, so, and unite the wires, as you can see. And then what you can actually do is fold that down and force them into the socket, just to get them out of the way a little bit. And then we just repeat that on the other side. So one sec. And there we go. I just did the other wire off camera just because it's easier when I'm not having to hold it down here under the camera to see what I'm doing and not accidentally trim the wires. So we've got the two wires, slightly different lengths, but that doesn't matter. So what we are going to do is marry it up to this. So what we'll do is we'll trim the negative first and just get rid of that bit of insulation. Ideally you'd want to keep all the wires as thin as possible, as short as possible, and conceal as much as you could. On some ships like A-Wings, the hull is a cavity, so you can actually you can make them a little bit longer and then fit the wires down into the model. Obviously that isn't so much an option with the X-Wing, just because it's pretty much needle shaped. So what I did there was just measured off roughly the distance that we want this one to be as well. So just trim that round. That is one problem with working with wires this fine, is standard gauge wire strippers will not hold them. So you have to basically use a pair of cutters and a little bit of care. And then these helping hands, the most useful tool you will ever have. Painting, modelling, electrics, anything, they're always worth having on your desktop. 1 second, just let me pull focus down to there. Sorry about the glare here. Just seems to be a very bright evening here in Edinburgh. So we'll just tin these wires. Just get a little bit of solder on them. And that way, what we do is we can just tap the two together. I'll just try and do this in such a way that you can actually see what I'm doing. Just tap the two together and just give it a quick tap with the soldering iron, and the solder that's on the wires will flow together and seal the two together. So there we are. Now what we'll do is we take a very small section of this plastic heat shrink. If we were working on longer wire runs, what I would have done is placed it on one half of the join, soldered the connection together, slipped it up and then sealed it round. But unfortunately these are so short that you can't do that, because the heat will travel along the wire and shrink the heat shrink wrap to the section of wire that it's resting on, which generally isn't the bit that you need insulated. So what I'm just doing is I'll cut it open like so and form like a little, oops, just take off that very top bit and form basically a small shroud, which will just fit around one of these. Just the negative is the slightly easier one to get to. Just turn that so that the cut side is facing out the way, and tap that with a soldering iron just to shrink it down around that. The other thing you can do here, which I won't do this time but I normally do, is just wrap a tiny bit of electrical tape around it. I'm not doing that because my son stole my electrical tape and ate half the roll, so I have no idea where it is. These are the joys of trying to do fine fiddly things with a 4-year-old in the house. So we've just got that wrapped around like so. And then what we'll do is we'll take a slightly larger piece, roughly measure it. We want about the length of the thing. Just use your thumbnail to put a slight crimp in it. Put that off, and this is a slightly larger size that will actually fit over the JST connector. Now you can buy JST connectors that come off the socket, but they're a slightly different type to the ones that I use, just because I'm a creature of habit and I like to use the same type of connectors on all of my ships so that they're all compatible with each other. It means that I don't have to hunt around for a different base each time. I can just pop one off and pop it back onto a different base, and I know for a fact it's going to work. The worst thing that happens is that sometimes the positive and negative are the opposite way rounds. They'll have one company will produce with the positive on the left and negative on the right, and another company will produce with the positive on the right and negative on the left. And so I will inevitably forget that and spend ages wondering why my ships aren't lighting on certain bases, only to realise that I need to pop the battery in the opposite way round in the base. Incidentally, common misconception that you need to have your resistors, that's the word, how did I forget that? Resistors on the positive side of a circuit. You can place them anywhere in the circuit and they will stop, and they will resist across the entire circuit. So if you have got resistors in your bases for whatever reason, I don't recommend it myself, just because it means you can only use it with the one ship, and you have that problem, you don't have to go around swapping around resistors onto other sides of circuits. Don't know why you might want to do that anyway, but I don't know how some people think. Personally, I think that having resistors on your bases is a pretty poor idea, just because it means that you are tied to using that one base with that one ship. And like I say, I'm a very lazy man. I like to carry as few things with me when I go out to play. So if I can get away with having a couple of small bases, one or two medium bases, and a large base, and that cover all of my lists, then that is what I will do. So there we go. That shrouding is just a little bit tight on the top there, but I'll just trim that with a knife when you're not looking. So we'll just pop a dab of super glue in this base here, just to get it to sit nice and flush and not wobble about like that. Thing about super glue you have to remember is that it is technically an epoxy. It's a epoxy resin that is cured by the moisture in the air. So you can use it for things like this, essentially filling small voids, and it will work. It just takes a devil of a time to set. So we just leave that for a few minutes, and while that is setting, I will just find a base and demonstrate how it works. There we are. Sorry, my desk's an absolute tip at the moment. So here we are, and as you can see, I've replaced the stem with a piece of brass tubing. Thank you, Rasta, a million times for giving me that idea. Prior to that, I was drilling through the plastic stems with a hand drill and trying to get them straight, and then running the wires through them, and it was an utter ball ache, and I felt like the biggest dickhead in the world when I saw Rasta saying that he likes to swap his stems for pieces of brass tube. So thank you again for making me feel like an utter moron, mate. So yep, just clips on like so, and doesn't work. 1 second. I'm just going to do some quick. This often happens. I'm just going to change that battery quickly, see if that's the problem. Maybe do some. There we go. It was the battery. There we go. You can see the 4. Turn off the light, block that. You can see the 4 engines lighting up nicely. And they still open and close. So I hope that was, at the very least, reasonably instructional. If you've got any questions, feel free to pop them in the comments. Feel free to poke me on my Facebook page, Full Mod Lighting. Feel free to poke me on my website, Full Mod Lighting. If you've got any questions, any requests for ships you'd like to see me do, any suggestions for how I can improve this other than, not being such a shambling wreck. At the moment, I think I have 1 subscriber on here, and that's my other account, so subscribe if you really want to. Until next time, take it easy, guys.